All right, there, econ friends. Welcome back to our next video. So in the previous videos, we've introduced resource markets generally, and then we did labor demand. In this video, we're going to shift over from labor demand to labor supply. And once we have labor supply down, then we're going to be able to take our labor demand knowledge, our labor supply knowledge, and put those two together to form equilibrium in a labor market, okay? So we're going to cover labor supply, then we're going to cover equilibrium, and then we'll wrap up by discussing the shifts and the ways that labor supply curves can shift, because again, as you know, whenever you have a supply and demand going on, a shift in any curve is going to alter the equilibrium. In the case of a labor market, altering wage rates. Okay, let's jump in. And let's begin with the basic idea that, as with other supply curves, labor supply, technically speaking, can be analyzed from the perspective of either the individual worker or from the perspective of the market as a whole. This should kind of ring a bell when we were talking about perfect competition, and we talked about the market and then the firm, and the idea in perfect competition that in product markets, in a competitive product market, you recall that the market supply and demand outcome pushed over to the firm. Okay, keep that on your back burner. Okay, but again, broad idea, labor supply can be seen from the perspective of the individual, the actual individual worker, or the market as a whole. When you analyze the individual worker's supply of labor, one of the big things that grounds this analysis in economics and in labor theory is that you have to bear in mind that if you work more hours, okay, if you increase your quantity of labor hours worked, you're going to earn more income. But at the same time, you will be sacrificing increasing amounts of leisure. Okay. In other words, we believe in economic theory that labor and leisure are effectively substitutes. Substitute uses, this should not be if, sorry, of your scarce time. So we ground the idea of the individual labor supply around the first big concept of trade-off, which we already discussed in many contexts. In the context of labor, you as a prospective worker can choose to do one of two things with your time, labor or leisure. We know that if you work more hours, you're going to earn more income, but if you work more hours, you're going to have less leisure. When you talk about these two things together and you talk about the trade-offs, it leads to what we're going to consider two very different effects in the labor market for individuals. The first effect is the substitution effect. And the second effect is what we're going to call the income effect. The substitution effect on the supply of labor basically refers to the effect that as a worker works more at higher wages, the opportunity cost of leisure increases. The substitution effect refers to the effect that occurs, again, when workers will work more at higher wages because the opportunity cost of not working goes up. So the substitution effect says that if you make more per hour at higher wages, you're going to work more. Because number one, you want to make more income, and number two, the opportunity cost of not working rises as wages go up. Remember, opportunity cost is what you give up. So if your wage rates, your potential wage rates go up, the opportunity cost of leisure goes up. So you say, nope, less leisure, more work, make that money. That's the substitution effect. The income effect, on the other hand, refers to the opposite. The income effect suggests that workers will supply less labor at higher wages because as you make more and more and more money, you don't need to work as much. And as you make more and more and more income, get this, you can afford more leisure, and therefore you're going to demand more leisure. So we've got these two kind of contradictory forces in play. The substitution effect says that as wage rates go up, you're going to work more. The income effect says as the wage rate goes up, you don't need to work as much and you're going to work less. You're going to demand more leisure, work less hours. Okay? How do we reconcile these two things? Well, basically, we believe in labor market economics that given these two contradictory effects, the substitution effect and the income effect, an individual's labor supply curve will be modeled, let's make this cleaner for you, sorry, as backward bending. In other words, if you take a look here at panel B, this is how we typically model the labor supply curve for the individual. It's backward bending. Note that over here in panel A, we would predict that an ordinary supply curve would just be straight upward. But we believe that given the counter effects of the income effect and the substitution effect in individual decision making, the individual labor supply curve is going to be backward bending. Notice that in this first section, as wages go up, people will work more hours because they want to make more money and the opportunity cost of leisure goes up. So we leisure less and we labor more. But notice that at a certain point, which here arbitrarily is this, P star L, at this point, at higher incomes, the income effect kicks in. And we say, wow, let's move to red for just contrast. We say, whoa, now that I'm making even more money, I don't need to work as many hours. I can afford and demand more leisure. So at a certain point, as wages go up, people work a bit less, and the supply of labor, again, for the individual, bends backwards. Okay, this is the backward bending theory, and this reflects the individual, not the market, but the individual labor supply curve. Okay, the market labor supply curve is easy. So again, our first one, A, was the individual. At the market level, very easy, very common sense. The market supply of labor, like all market supply curves, is upward sloping. And that's going to look like this. Okay? So now that we know what the labor supply curve looks like, and we previously covered the labor demand curve, we can put them all together. And let's go back before we do that to this. You might remember this from a previous video. I had used this drawing, this chart, this graph, to illustrate how many workers would be hired. Okay, so you might recall that we had the labor demand curve, which was the MRP, the marginal revenue product of labor. And then we also had, I assumed, a wage rate of $500, which gave us the wage. And we had this equilibrium point, and that was our number of workers. Okay, and we learned that earlier. But notice that earlier when we learned that, we never actually figured out why the wage rate was $500. I just said, assume that the wage rate's 500. I think in the chart we did 100, but I just said, assume this number to make your decision. But we never actually figured out, well, but what made the wage rate 500? Okay, now that we understand labor supply and labor demand, we're able to do that. Because ultimately, in a supply and demand setting, as you know, the price of labor is going to be determined at labor market equilibrium. And this is going to be the point where the market supply of labor and the market demand for labor intersect. In other words, now that we've built all the pieces, we can bring them together. We can take the labor demand, set it equal to the labor supply, and that's going to be equilibrium. And you see it right here. Notice that we're talking again about a competitive market, and therefore, much like the PC firm in the product market was a price taker, the competitive firm in this labor market is also a price taker, in this case, a wage taker. Okay, let's break this down, make it a little bit bigger so you can see it. In panel A, we have equilibrium in the market. We have the downward sloping labor demand curve, which we already understood to be the MRP. We have the upward sloping labor supply curve, which we just covered. Those meet right here at equilibrium. Okay, so this point is the equilibrium point. It is where the supply of labor equals the demand for labor, and critically, this equilibrium point gives us an equilibrium wage rate of $500. It is this wage rate that becomes the wage rate that the individual firm is faced with. So again, earlier, we had just sort of assumed, oh, the wage rate is 500. Now we understand how the equilibrium wage rate is formed. The equilibrium wage rate represents the intersection point between the supply of labor and the demand for labor. This determines the market level equilibrium wage, which the competitive firm must take as a price taker. Because remember, wages are just the price of labor. So this number goes over here, and this becomes the wage that the firm is faced with. Notice again that because the firm is a price taker, we assume that the firm can hire as many workers as it wants, but it has to pay that market wage rate. In this case, $500. This gives us a perfectly horizontal, perfectly elastic labor supply curve, and this is what the firm faces when it makes its decision. This is how we built this model, okay? Let's summarize that very quickly. Again, the equilibrium wage represents the labor supply curve that the individual firm must take because they have to pay that wage because it's the price taker aspect. In competitive labor markets, again, individual firms are price takers, that is wage takers. They have to take this wage, in this case, $500, as a given. And as we know, this is going to make the labor supply curve that faces the individual firm perfectly elastic, perfectly horizontal. And there you go. Okay. So this then is bringing labor supply and labor demand together to form labor equilibrium. Now you understand how we determined this equilibrium wage rate here that the firm was forced to accept in making its hiring decision, okay? So I need you to see these things as a chain of thinking that leads to decisions that then leads to other decisions. Now that we understand this, let me take a quick minute to break down a couple of subtleties. Big thing again, we took labor market, resource market, supply and demand. We determined a price, and that price was the wage. Here's one big subtlety. Note that in product markets, note that just as in product markets, in resource markets or labor markets, prices play a critical role. We learned way back in supply demand analysis that prices are critical. They convey information, they embody data, they provide incentives. That same role of prices that was so crucial in product markets is just as crucial in resource markets. What are some of the roles that prices play? or that any, that wages play, that any resource price plays? Well, number one, these resource prices, they convey to firms information about the scarcity of resources. Obviously, as a resource price goes up, that tells a firm, hey, this resource is more expensive. And the firm then has to make some decisions. Number two, tied to that, these resource prices give firms very strong incentives to use resources wisely, to conserve them, to substitute out of them if the prices get too high. So from the point of view of the firm, the resource prices give a lot of critical information that in turn provides incentives that affect decisions. And number three, and critically, for your point as a future worker, okay, we're flipping now from the point of the boss to the point of view as the future worker. Resource prices are going to give you as a worker incentive to learn new skills, to increase your productivity, to increase your creativity, to understand and try to find out what bosses need, what firms require, and then adapt your skill levels and adapt your learning to meet those areas that are in demand. Again, another clue as to how labor markets can help you be a richer, wealthier, more productive worker. Okay, so that's that. Finally, so the first kind of subtle takeaway was the importance of prices. Finally, let's move into the idea of shifting. Because the equilibrium wage rate in a labor market, like any market, is going to be determined at the intersection of supply and demand, then we know, we can conclude that any shifts in the market supply of labor will change the equilibrium wage rates. Okay, a moment ago, we learned that the supply and demand will meet to determine the wage, which is the labor price, which is the resource price. We determine that that resource price sends important signals. Now we're wrapping up this lecture, this little video, by understanding that since equilibrium determines prices, any shifts in the supply of labor are going to shift equilibrium and ultimately affect wage rates. You can see right here, a simple shift, a simple example. We started off right here. We call this, we'll call this supply of labor 1 and the demand for labor. We had an original equilibrium point that set a wage of $500. Let's move to red for contrast. Something happened. We don't know what yet, but something happened that somehow increased, shifted the supply of labor from SL1 to SL2. As in any supply and demand analysis, this gives us a new equilibrium, which corresponds to a lower wage, but higher levels of employment. Okay, so the same ideas that were grounded in supply demand shifts in product markets apply here. With that said, let's sum up this lecture by going over some of the factors that can shift market labor supply. And there's a couple. Factor number one, immigration and population growth. The simple fact of the matter is, if the working age population, we hinted at that in our in our unemployment discussion, those terms of working age population, if that population generally increases, the supply of labor will increase. We also have the idea of taste and preference. This is a really, really important one and a real big predictor of wage differentials, which we'll get to in a later lecture. But the basic idea here is that people typically have different preferences for work in different industries or different situations. Some people like work with lots of hours and lots of pay. Some people like work with fewer hours so they can have more of a balance. Some people want to work indoors, some outdoors, some with their hands, some with their brains. So people vary in what they look for in their ideal job. This taste or preference factor is going to influence the supply of labor. Note also, and kind of critically, that this includes things that are tied to, let's say, workplace danger or comfort. The reality is not all jobs are equal. Some jobs are more comfortable than others, and some jobs are riskier than others. And an individual's taste and preference and risk threshold will oftentimes dictate what jobs they move into. And that's going to have corresponding impacts on shifts in the supply curve in that labor market and subsequently on wages. Third thing, non-labor income. Okay, this is a really big one. Since when we talk about non-labor income, we are talking about the ways that not workers, we're talking about the ways that people can make money without working. So this includes, for example, social insurance programs like unemployment or welfare, things like that. But the basic idea is, since the decision to work or not to work was ultimately about the comparison between labor and leisure, remember that? Since the decision to work was basically a comparison between the potential wages earned if you worked against the potential benefits of not working, that labor-leisure trade-off, we believe that generally anything that changes the benefits of not working will shift the labor supply curve. In other words, my friends, if you are able to generate some sort of income without working, that's going to change your demand for work. You're going to be more or less likely to work if you have more or less income coming in from non-work sources. Okay? This is really important from the policy level, because we see a lot of this at the policy level. When I talk about these non-labor factors, we're talking about lots of different programs. Programs that make college more affordable, for instance. Imagine a program that basically gave you a lot more financial aid or cheaper loans with lower interest rates to go to school, okay? If you can generate more income this way, it's going to make college look more attractive, which will make working at the moment look less attractive. On the other hand, if you didn't have programs that made college more affordable, you'd probably need to work more, either because you couldn't afford college and you wouldn't go, or you need to work more hours to pay for it. So again, notice that a non-labor income in the form of aid for going to colleges is going to have a ripple effect in labor markets. How about programs that lower the cost of childcare? Same idea. Suppose that there were programs that gave parents some sort of non-labor income, some sort of income source to help them offset the cost of childcare. Well, that's going to change the labor-leisure trade-off in those parents' minds, and that's going to affect labor supply. You can also see it in government support programs that help people without jobs, like unemployment programs. There was a whole big thing in the middle of COVID where the government had given lots of people who were laid off really, really generous unemployment benefits. They wanted to keep people intact. They wanted to be attuned to the crisis and the pandemic. So between the federal and the state, lots of unemployed people got very generous unemployment benefits. Well, guess what happened? As soon as the government said, okay, you can go back to work now, and as soon as businesses were allowed to reopen, those businesses had a really tough time finding workers, because a lot of workers realized that they were making just as much money from unemployment benefits between the federal and state programs combined as they were for working. So you can imagine that, rationally, increases in non-labor income in the form of unemployment insurance at the federal and at the state level basically told a lot of people, I don't want to work now. And that reduced the labor supply. Okay. You may have issues with this ethically, but it's critical to understand the underlying economics. Okay. So again, market labor supply can shift due to immigration and population growth, taste or preference, including danger and comfort trade-offs, non-labor income sources. Number 4, changing wages and other occupations. This is an idea of substitutes. You as a potential worker, you have substitute options. You can work in this industry or that industry, in this region or that region. If you see wages changing in other occupations, that's going to influence your desire to work in your current occupation. And that can influence the labor supply and shift it to the right or to the left. Imagine, for example, that you have a business major and you're working in, I don't know, retail services. You're a retail manager. If all of a sudden you see that in the gaming industry, which is booming right now, the wages for managers with business degrees is booming in the gaming industry. You're going to move out of retail management into gaming. You're going to follow the higher wage. That's your incentive. That's going to increase the supply of labor in gaming and decrease the supply of labor in retail with corresponding wage differences in both. And fifth and finally, we would argue in economics that the market supply curve will shift based on taxes. Because at the end of the day, in the end, you're really not motivated by your salary at the gross level, gross meaning pre-tax. People are ultimately motivated by their take-home pay. Okay, there's a couple terms for you. Your gross pay is the total amount that you earn based on how much you worked and how much you make. Your net pay is what you get to walk home with after all your taxes have been taken out. Fundamentally, we believe in economics that people are motivated by their take-home pay, that people are motivated by their net pay, their after-tax pay. And this means that as tax rates change, people's take-home pay is going to be affected. And this will influence their decisions to enter or exit or stay in a labor market. This is especially true today in families that have two incomes. The decisions of the second wage earner, typically the lower earning wage earner, are highly driven by taxes. Okay, this is going to affect labor supply. That's all we got, my friends. So in this lecture, to recap, we learned about labor supply at the individual level and at the market level. We took that market level and formed our equilibrium. We then learned how wages are formed and the price taker element that firms have to accept. We recapped some of the important signals and functions that prices play. And then finally, we identified what's going to shift labor supply curves to have corresponding impacts on equilibrium. Thanks for tuning in. I'll catch you next time.